Good morning. It is wonderful to be here with you this morning. We are in part 58 of 66 through our 66-part series of the Bible. Can you believe it? All right, 2 people are excited. I'll get the rest of you by the end of this sermon. All right, we are in the book of Lamentations, and there's no better way to introduce the book of Lamentations than to just start reading it. Let's begin. Alas, which is a great word to start a book. Alas, the city once full of people now sits alone. The prominent lady among the nations has become a widow. The princess who once ruled the provinces has become a forced laborer. She weeps bitterly at night. Tears stream down her cheeks. She has no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. We're 2 verses in, and all of a sudden there's this emotion and this tense feeling. There's all these words that are flying at us, and we get this sense that, oh no, this is going to be one of those books of the Bible that is just real depressing to read. Then you go back 2 verses and read the title, Lamentations, and you say, I should have seen this coming. And after all of this abstract stuff, we read about how a city sits alone. We read about how the city then is personified as a woman who is crying. Tears are streaming down her cheeks. There's no one to comfort her. We all of a sudden get some very concrete language in verse 3. The poet of this poem writes, Judah has departed into exile under affliction and harsh oppression. Now this is a concrete historical event. The abstract language has stopped for just a moment in this poem. And to understand what event we are talking about, we have to go back 3,000 years ago to the establishment of the kingdom of Israel sometime around the year 1000 BCE. Now, a man named Saul united the 12 tribes of Israel and led as their first sort of king, and Israel lived and existed for the next 400 years. Until the time around 586 BCE when a superpower rose to the east known as Babylon. And Babylon launched one attack in 597 and failed to conquer Jerusalem, but ultimately conquered them in 586 BCE. They leveled the city. They took whatever survivors were left back with them across the desert and forced them to live in captivity, in exile, in the city of Babylon. Now, the Babylonian plan of conquest was that they would take all the nations they conquered and bring the survivors back and force them to intermarry with Babylonian people to create more Babylonians, which meant a stronger economy and a stronger military. So the Babylonian way of life was essentially to wipe out people's way of life, their history, their culture, and force them to live as Babylonians so that they could make more Babylonians. Now, it's easy for us to talk about this in 2021, some 2,600 years after this occurred, but imagine being there for a moment. There is a beautiful painting by the artist named James Tissot who captured this moment when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, and these people, the people of Judah, are being led out of Jerusalem into exile. This is the moment that this poem in Lamentations is trying to capture. And so when we get kind of put off, or we kind of hold it at a distance and say, wow, this language is very intense, understand that we're talking about a very intense moment in the history of Jerusalem. The poet continues in verse 4. He says, the roads to Zion mourn because no one travels to the festivals. All her city gates are deserted. Her priests groan. Her virgins grieve. She is in bitter anguish. Her foes subjugated her. Her enemies are at ease, for blank afflicted her because of her many acts of rebellion. Now, knowing what you know now, we would assume that we're going to read here in this verse about who afflicted Judah. And the answer, of course, is Babylon. I mean, Babylon is the conquering army. Babylon is the one who launched the assault on Jerusalem, right? But that's not who the poet cites as being the one who afflicted this pain upon them. The poet instead says, for the Lord afflicted her because of her many acts of rebellion. Now understand what's going on here. Babylon attacks Jerusalem, and Jerusalem responds by saying, oh, I know who God is in this story. It's Babylon. Babylon is attacking us on behalf of our God. Now, if you're like me, you read this and you say, this is not the intuitive way of thinking about this story. There's something counterintuitive in this theology and the way of thinking that all of a sudden someone attacks us and we think, man, they're acting like God in this story. So how do we get here? How do we understand why the poet of Lamentations would look at this Babylonian attack and say, oh, they're acting on behalf of God? Well, to understand that, you have to go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible, and we studied it just a few months ago here at Paradox. Now, if you were with us during that time, you will remember that Deuteronomy contains a 4-hour sermon, yes, 4 hours, where Moses, right before Israel is about to go into the promised land, and right before Moses is about to die, he gives this sermon that says, this is who I want you to be once you enter the promised land. In the heart of that sermon is something that scholars refer to as the Mosaic Covenant. Now, this may sound intimidating to you, but it's not that intimidating. Mosaic just means of Moses, and covenant means promise. And basically, Moses told the people of Israel that there was a promise that God was giving them. And the Mosaic Covenant basically says God is making a promise with us. Now, the promise can be found in chapter 30, verse 16, when we read, the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? The problem is there's some fine print that happens right before this verse. We read, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing God's commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. Notice the words if and then. Because when we talk about the Mosaic Covenant, it's important that we're honest about what this covenant entails. God didn't just make a promise to Israel, God made a conditional promise to Israel. Hey, if you keep my commandments, then I will bless you. And then Moses says, but I just want to be very clear how serious we are about this covenant, because if you don't keep the commandments, let's see what happens. In the very next verse, Moses says, but if your hearts turn away and you do not hear and are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. So while most Christians know this story as God had some promised land for the people of Israel, a much better way to understand it is that God had some conditionally promised land for the people of Israel. And the Mosaic Covenant's theology is very simple to understand. The idea is that God will allow the Israelites to inhabit the promised land if they are loyal, if they are devout, and if they are faithful exclusively to God. And what that theology looks like today, while we don't necessarily have a promised land here in Redlands, California, the theology looks very similar to something like this. If you are good to God, then God will be good to you. And while that sounds good, there's also an underlying covenant that is not spoken about that we have to acknowledge. Because the other side of it is, but if you aren't good to God, then it's game over. Yeah. So, that theology directly impacts the writings of Lamentations. The poet says, the Lord afflicted her, Jerusalem, because of her many acts of rebellion. This is why a few verses later in verse 8, the poet writes, Jerusalem committed terrible sin, therefore she became an object of scorn. All who admired her have despised her because they have seen her nakedness. She groans aloud and turns away in shame. And we keep reading for 2 more verses, and we think to ourselves, okay, I've got this book figured out. It seems very obvious to me what this book is about. After the first 10 verses, we get the sense that this poet is telling the people of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, see, I told you so. We had a promise back from the lips of Moses that if we kept our religion devoutly, then everything would work out for us and we'd get to stay here forever. Well, we didn't stay here forever. So therefore, it's very clear we didn't keep the rules. Now, with that theology in mind, we can almost hear this sermon being written and performed for you this morning. Keep the rules, and God will bless you. But if you don't, then God will strike you down. Let's close with prayer. Now, just when we think that we've got this book figured out and we say, this is a terrifying book, all of a sudden in verse 11, halfway through this poem, we are introduced to a second character who begins to speak. The prophet/poet is interrupted by a woman who represents the city of Jerusalem. She does not wait for the prophet to finish speaking. She says, "Look, O Lord, consider that I have become worthless. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by on the road? Look and see, is there any pain like mine? The Lord has afflicted me. God has inflicted it on me." And when God burned with anger, God sent down fire into my bones, and it overcame my bones. God spread out a trapper's net for my feet. God made me turn back. God has made me desolate. I am faint all day long. My sins are bound around my neck like a yoke. They are fastened together by God's hand. God has placed God's yoke on my neck, and God has sapped my strength. God has handed me over to those whom I cannot resist. I weep because of these things. My eyes flow with tears, for there is no one in sight who can comfort me or encourage me. Now, the prophet begins to speak again about how this city deserved it, and once again, she interrupts the prophet and says, "Yes, I was terribly rebellious, but out in the streets, the sword bereaves a mother of her children. Inside the house, death is present. Let all of my enemies' wickedness come before you, God." Notice how everyone else is acting bad too. God, won't you afflict them just as you have afflicted me because of all of my acts of rebellion? For my groans are many, and my heart is sick with sorrow. And just like that, the first poem of Lamentations comes to an end. Now, there are 4 more chapters, and they all contain 4 different poems, and they're all about the Babylonian exile. But this poem, Lamentations 1, is meant to be read and stand on its own. And when we look at this poem, we realize there are 2 central characters having a dialogue. There is the prophet and the city of Jerusalem, who is embodied in the voice of a woman. The prophet in this poem is telling the city of Jerusalem, "You deserve all of the suffering of this exile." And the city of Jerusalem says, "Fine. Sure, I wasn't great. I wasn't perfect. I brought some of this on myself. But you know what, prophet? Do you understand how cruel this suffering is? Because I think this punishment from God is excessive. I don't think that God is just in inflicting these tears upon us." And after a moment, the city of Jerusalem looks around at everything and looks at who they are and looks at the neighbors who don't worship God, who don't keep religion, and they think about how the neighbors don't have this Mosaic covenant. And Jerusalem looks around and says, "Wait, God, if we're suffering this much, why aren't my neighbors suffering as much as I am?" Because while we weren't as religious as we should have been, those people aren't religious at all. And when you consider the Mosaic Covenant, if you are good to God, then God will be good to you. This poem, voiced by the character of the city of Jerusalem, basically says that this covenant right here is not a blessing. It's a curse. If we're held to a higher standard, how is that justice? How is that fair? Because yes, we've made mistakes, but so have they, and they seem fine. Now, if you're like me, you're reading this at this point, you realize what's going on, and you're saying to yourself, this is a rather stunning turn of events. And when you start to read commentaries on this that tell you what this book is about and what the thesis of Lamentations is, you come across the great Jewish scholar, Dr. Adele Berlin, who is considered to be one of the world's most authoritative voices on the book of Lamentations. She writes what the thesis statement of Lamentations is. She says, the entire book of Lamentations may be thought of as an appeal for God's mercy, yet God remains silent. And if you were to ask me what the thesis of Lamentations is, I would agree with Dr. Berlin and say, I think the Lamentations thesis is God does not answer prayer. Now, if you're like me, you hear that and you say, wait, we're not supposed to say that out loud. Sure, we have unanswered prayers in our personal lives, but we don't talk about it, Craig. We've got to keep this on the down low. And yet, here's this book in the Bible, among all sorts of other books that tell us that, hey, God answers prayers, just have a little more faith, pray a little harder, go to a little more church. And in the midst of all of that, there's this book, Lamentation, that says, I don't know. Does God answer prayer? Because there was this whole period during the exile when all of the people felt very strongly that God did not, in fact, answer prayers. There was this begging for mercy, and God remained silent. Now, the fact that this book in the Bible is remarkable, but it becomes even more remarkable when you consider how this book came to be in the Bible. Because the exile in Babylon took place in 586 BCE. This exile went on for 47 years. That's a lot of years. It's a lot more than I have been alive. And during those 47 years, there was no guarantee of liberation. There was no promise that they would ever get to go back. There was a real fear that they were living as the last generation of their people. And then the strangest thing happened. In 539 BCE, another military superpower known as Persia arose to the east of Babylon, and they launched an attack led by Cyrus the Great on Babylon and conquered Babylon and found among the Babylonians the people of Judah. They said, who are you? And they said, we're the people of Judah. And the Persians said, would you like to go back to Judah? And the people of Judah said, of course we would. And the Persians said, well, why don't you go back then? And the people of Judah said, this seems too good to be true. To which the response was, of course it is. You have to pay a lot of taxes. And the people of Judah said, okay, it's better than Babylon. And they went back to Jerusalem and arrived there. Persia taxed them very heavily, but gave them money to rebuild their temple. And they rebuilt the temple sometime in the 5th to 6th century BCE, reconsecrated. Jerusalem rose up from the ashes, and they began to live there. 4 centuries later, it's 150 BCE. Israel, very unlikely, has its own independence against all of these different superpowers that are passing back and forth. This period is known as a golden age of prosperity, and it is referred to as the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, we do not know this for sure. This is just a guess. But most scholars believe that the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians refer to as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible came together during this era. And it's here in the 2nd century BCE that a committee, most likely, got together in, most likely, Jerusalem, and sat down and said, let's make a Bible. And I would have loved to be at this committee meeting, because I've been to a lot of exciting committee meetings in my life. I don't think anything can top this one. Because you can imagine, they're sitting around, talking to each other, and somebody's like, Genesis, totally in. Another guy's like, of course, why wouldn't Genesis be in? They add the first 5 books of the Bible. That's easy. And then they get to Ruth. And you just know someone's going to make the inappropriate comment like, really, Ruth? You know, like, maybe we should include some female perspective. And there's an eye roll from the patriarchy that goes, oh, fine. They go on and on. They start listing all the books. And someone at this committee meeting spoke up and said, you know what? Let's make sure we include the book that reminds us that God doesn't answer prayer. And somebody else at that committee meeting heard that and said, that's a great idea. We should totally keep Lamentations in there. Now, I assume there was a debate, right? I assume they went back and forth and said, no, Lamentations, too dark, it's too heavy, we've been restored. That was centuries ago that the exile occurred. Why on earth do we need to worry about people's pain 400 years ago? Wouldn't it be better if we just focused on the positive? Wouldn't it be better if we included a book that was written after Persia liberated the people of Judah from the Babylonians? Wouldn't that be better if it showed how God restored us? Why do we need a book that was written in exile that had no hope for a future? And when you look at what these people did, they ultimately decided to put Lamentations in the Hebrew Bible. And what that shows is it shows this developing sense of human consciousness that is a stunning progression to behold when you back up the camera a little bit and look at the whole of Scripture. Sometime around 1300 BCE, Moses stood on a rock and preached to the Israelites. In that sermon, he said, I promise you that if you're good to God, God will be good to you, and you can live in the promised land. And the people of Israel believed this. They trusted it. And guess what? It worked. Along came a king named David who had a son named Solomon. Solomon led them into another golden age of prosperity sometime around 950 BCE. And there was wealth and riches and power and might. Everything was going according to plan. Everyone said to themselves, guess what? It works. We're religious. We built a temple. God took care of us. Let's just keep being religious. And after Solomon, things started to fall apart. It got so bad that in 722 BCE, the nation of Assyria wiped out 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in 586 BCE, the unspeakable happened to the remaining tribe of Judah when Babylon attacked them. And all of a sudden, all these questions arose where people started saying, I know we weren't the most religious people on the planet, but we were religious enough, right? Like, we didn't deserve this, did we? And it's almost like you can feel a new genre of literature being born because every box, every indicator, every safety net has been taken away. And Lamentations comes out of this. 5 different poems, maybe by different authors, maybe by the same ones, we don't know. But ultimately, Lamentations arises from this period of uncertainty and says, we don't know if God even hears us anymore. Then in 539 BCE, Persia shows up. Feels like a miracle. Who would ever blame anyone for saying that was an actual miracle? Persia sends them back to what they would call the Promised Land. They arrive in Judah. They live there for 400 years. They're putting a Bible together, and they're talking about what's in, what's out, and there is this sense that we really need to include this book of Lamentations. Well, why? Well, we don't want to forget these people because they're our ancestors too. And I know it's not convenient. I know it may not make sense, but if we forget what they felt and experienced about God, there's something profane about that omission, isn't there? Not only that, but when you look at all of our history, there is a sense that this will work for every season. But it didn't work for them, did it? And when the promise is that this will work all the time, and we have in our history that it didn't work all the time, we have to remind ourselves that maybe this promise was wrong. And I think that by their inclusion of the book of Lamentations, it is this stunning statement where they are coming forward and saying we must never forget that the Mosaic Covenant doesn't work. The idea that if we're good to God, then God will be good to us works sometimes, but it does not work all the times. Because we know people who are extremely devoted to God who still suffer. I saw this play out a few years ago, back in the year 2015, which feels like a lifetime ago right now. I had the honor and privilege of leading a high school praise band at a junior-senior Bible camp up in the mountains. Now, this is one of my great joys of my career. I miss this terribly. There are several people who have been to Bible camp in this room and who have served as part of this. You can be excited. It's totally fine. Yeah, okay. And I got to work with the best musicians around, and it was amazing what we'd come up with. And on top of all of that, the crowd was just on another level when it came to the hypometer. There was so much joy in the room. You would just say, "Good morning," and everyone would be like, "Yeah, morning, good, this is great." And there'd be jumping, dancing, there'd be attempts at dancing. It was a wonderful experience. And in 2015, I had the idea that maybe we should include a song that questions God in the same way that the book of Lamentations questions God. So we introduced a song that we've sung here several times. It's called "Does Your Heart Break" by the Brilliants. And this song talks about children who are hungry. This song talks about racial injustice. This song cries out to God for mercy, and then the song tells us that God remains silent. So into this atmosphere, with the lights and the fog machine and the jumping up and down and the screaming, we were like, we're going to bring it down a little. And at first, the high school students were like, what is this? Why is this? What are we doing? This is not what I signed up for. But high school kids are resilient. And by the end of this Bible camp, they were singing this lament at the top of their lungs. And I will tell you to this day, I will never forget the sound of people singing a passionate lament. Now, while high school students are resilient, adults are not. And we had some chaperones on this trip, you know what I'm saying, right? They expressed their concerns to me throughout the whole weekend. They would say, "So why are we doing this?" I'd be like, "Oh, you know, Book of Lamentations, it's in the Bible." They're like, "Yeah, it's not a good idea to question God's existence on stage." And I'd be like, "Well, why not?" They're like, "Craig, this is a Bible camp." And I would say, "Yeah, but, you know, in the Bible, Lamentations?" And they would say, no, you can't do this. Kids might become atheists if you do this. Because that would be the worst case scenario, right? And there was this real concern about us doing this song that was a full-on lament. Now, it's very easy for me to point the finger at them and say, like, those losers don't get it. But all you have to do is go back 5 years into the history, back to the year 2010, to meet 2010 Craig Hadley. And I remember very distinctly, very transparently, I sat in a worship service that my friend was leading music. And he decided to share with the congregation a lament that he wrote. It's a song called "There Is More," and it's begging God to show him that there is more to this life than all of the suffering and the random acts of violence he sees around him. Now, this was a friend singing this. And as a second-year seminary student in 2010, I remember watching that and being like, you're going to make all the people atheist. That service ended, and I turned to my other friend who was sitting in the service next to me, who was also a seminary student. I said to him, "Every song that is played in church should be happy and honor God." Yes, 2010. If anyone's taking a picture, make sure you get the 2010. Make sure that happens. I was terrified of a lament in a worship service. And when I asked myself, why was I terrified? Why was I so scared back then of somebody openly questioning God's existence in a worship service? I believe that I really wanted to believe the Mosaic Covenant. I wanted to believe that if I was good to God, that God would be good to me, because God can be good all the time. And all the time, God can be good. This statement right here is not going forward with the tradition, but instead is fighting the current and trying to go back to an older way of things that we already know doesn't work anymore. This is an attempt to return to the Mosaic Covenant. And if you are new here at Paradox, may I be the first to say, welcome. We are so glad that you are here. You may have heard us singing a lament and asking you to share your doubt. Tell us how you don't believe in God. We'd love to hear how your week has been terrible. Do you know why we do this? You know why we do this every week? It's to break our addiction, to return to what is easy. It's to make sure that we do not turn our religion into idolatry. And when I say idolatry, the idea that our worth is derived from how religious we are. And here is this line of progress, this idea, hey, if we're good to God, God will be good to us. It works, it's wonderful. Nope, doesn't work at all. We should remember that going forward. When you look at Scripture in this way, with a bird's eye view, you realize this is a lot more progressive than I was taught. This is way more inclusive than I was taught. We should have national days where we mourn for what has been lost. We should have days where we actually pause and recognize that there are times that God hasn't answered our prayer. We should have times where we denote and make room for sadness in our tradition and not just happiness and lights and fog machines all the time. And then you look around and you realize, it's just Christianity that struggles with this problem right now. Because when you look at where these books came from, it comes from the Jewish tradition. And within the Jewish tradition, there is a day known as Tisha B'Av. And this day is the day that the temple fell in 586 BCE. It takes place on the 9th of Av. Now, every year during this day, it is considered to be a national or a religious-wide day of mourning. It is a day in which the book of Lamentations is opened and read from. But not just read from in a way that the lights are on and everything makes sense. It is a day when the book of Lamentations is read on a low bench by candlelight, shrouded in darkness. Now, at the end of this service, we've invited Adam Whitmer to read Lamentations 1 in all of its entirety in order to try and pay homage and honor to Tisha B'Av. Now, I have to warn you, the reading takes about 4.5 minutes. And in our culture, that's about 38 TikTok videos. So you will be tempted to think to yourself, how long is this? It's 4.5 minutes. Just answer back in your brain those words, okay? My hope is that when we read it, you can stop analyzing it for just 5 minutes and instead experience the raw emotion, the raw questions, the raw uncertainty that people experienced 2,600 years ago. These words are from that era. And these words remind us today that we shouldn't just return to what is simple because it's what we know. We should instead stick with what we experience and trust that because it will be different than everything that's come before us and yet rooted in the same thing. When we consider what this book means and how it stands up and testifies to us, you know what? God doesn't answer prayer. And then that writing is included in the Bible. It all of a sudden teaches us something about the way we perceive church and gatherings and coming together as part of a religious ceremony. It teaches us that when someone stands up in church and says, God did not answer my prayer, we don't silence them. When someone stands up and says, oh, God does not exist, we don't debate them. When someone stands up and says, God broke a promise to me, we don't say, are you sure? And when someone says, God ignored my suffering, we don't say, that doesn't sound like God. Instead, when someone stands up in church and says those things, we can label that person as a radical. And I chose the word radical intentionally, because this English word is derived from the Latin word, which is radicalis. And radicalis is not something that means something new and progressive or a fresh idea. No, radicalis means of or relating to the root. The Latin word radix means deeply rooted. It's where we get the word radish from. Now, we consider that this is what it means to be a radical and not somebody who brings a new, out of left field idea, but someone who is actually committed to the tradition. It completely changes the way we perceive who we are. Merriam-Webster says this about radical. Radical came to describe what is at the base or the beginning. In other words, what is basic and fundamental. And I will tell you that if you go to a Bible camp and lead a praise and worship set and you're like, let's do a lament, people will describe you as radical. And they'll say, don't bring these new ideas here. And you'll say, no, this isn't a new idea. This is deeply rooted in our tradition. I'm actually being more conservative by introducing this song. And when you consider that this is the tradition, to be able to stand up freely and say, I don't believe in God today. You realize that the tradition, which is often viewed as ancient and old ways and just not an interesting way of thinking, you realize that the tradition is far more progressive than religion wants you to believe. My friends, if you do not believe that God exists, then when you put voice to that feeling, to that belief, it is at that moment that you are honoring the tradition of Scripture. I've often had people ask me, are you a Christian? Are you an atheist? What are you? To which I say, I'm both. I have moments of intense belief and moments of intense doubt. I'm a bit of a believing doubter, and I'm a bit of a doubting believer. And if that sounds like a paradox, welcome. We are glad you are here. My friends, this tradition is far more inclusive, accepting, and wide than you were taught. And on the days you feel like God doesn't answer your prayer, I want to offer you these words. I felt that too. And people 2,600 years ago felt that way too. And when you are honest about that, and when you say, doesn't anyone see me? You realize you're standing in the heart of the tradition. When we consider these 5 poems, we accept that these are radically inclusive ideas. Because the fact that these poems are in the Bible teaches us that whether we believe God is alive or we believe that God is dead, the tradition of Scripture welcomes all of us with open arms. May we stop distinguishing between the doubters and the believers. And may we recognize that this book, this tradition, this desire to know God or the absence of God more is ultimately for all of us. And you and I and we are at home in the tradition of Scripture.